The courtroom was packed to capacity, its atmosphere tense and almost suffocating. Rows of spectators leaned forward in their seats, murmuring quietly among themselves as the clock ticked on. The usual calm, orderly space felt electrified with anticipation, and the air seemed charged with something heavy, something unseen but unmistakable. At the center of it all stood Jamal Monroe, a boy of only 15, though in that moment, his presence filled the room like a man much older. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes stayed locked ahead. He looked small in his crisp shirt and slightly oversized blazer, but there was a weight to him that made the crowd silent the moment he opened his mouth. Across from him, presiding over the courtroom, sat Judge Monroe, a man known for his commanding presence, his unshakable principles, and his legendary ability to deliver justice. Today, however, his normally steady hands gripped the edges of his bench. His jaw was tight, and his gaze bore into his son with a mixture of confusion and something darker, fear. Jamal inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling as he steadied himself. When he finally spoke, his voice rang clear, louder than anyone expected from someone his age. "I know what you did," he said, his words cutting through the murmurs like a knife. A gasp rippled through the courtroom, a collective sound of disbelief and shock. Some exchanged glances, eyebrows raised in confusion. Others froze in place, their breath catching as they tried to process what they had just heard. Judge Monroe's expression didn't change immediately, but a flicker of something, a crack in his usually composed mask, crossed his face. He leaned forward slightly, gripping the gavel tighter, but he didn't speak. Not yet. Jamal's gaze stayed firm, unyielding. His father's silence only fueled the tension, stretching it out like a taut rope ready to snap. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, too low to make out clearly but loud enough to feel like a swarm of bees. "What's he talking about?" someone whispered from the back. "Why would he say that?" another voice asked. Jamal didn't flinch at the noise. He had spent months preparing for this moment, replaying it in his mind, questioning if he had the courage to see it through. But now that he was here, standing in front of his father, he realized something important: he wasn't afraid anymore. For years, Jamal had admired his father. Judge Monroe was a pillar in their community, a man whose decisions shaped lives and carried weight far beyond the courtroom walls. People spoke his name with respect. They saw him as fair, honorable, untouchable. But Jamal had seen what others didn't. Behind the polished suits and powerful speeches, there were secrets that had haunted Jamal for as long as he could remember. And today, he wasn't just here to tell the truth. He was here to make sure everyone else heard it, too. The judge finally broke the silence, his voice low and deliberate. "Jamal," he said, leaning forward slightly, his tone measured but sharp, "this is a courtroom. If you have something to say, you better explain yourself." Jamal's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile, not out of amusement, but out of determination. His father's composure couldn't scare him now. He had spent years being the quiet boy in the corner, the one overlooked, ignored, and underestimated. Not today. "Don't worry," Jamal said, his voice steady. "I'll explain everything." A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the crowd. A woman in the front row clasped her hands to her chest. Even the stenographer had paused mid-typing, her fingers hovering above the keys as she stared wide-eyed at the scene unfolding before her. Jamal took a step forward, holding his ground as he felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. His palms were damp, but he didn't wipe them against his pants. He couldn't afford to show even a hint of weakness. "It's about time people knew the truth," he continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. Judge Monroe straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening as his son spoke. He opened his mouth as if to interject but stopped himself, perhaps realizing that any interruption would only draw more suspicion. The courtroom was his domain, a place where he held all the power. And yet, in that moment, it felt as if the balance had shifted. Jamal wasn't just a boy standing before a judge. He was a son standing before his father. And that made the stakes infinitely higher. The judge's deep voice cut through the room again, this time softer but laced with a dangerous edge. "This isn't a game, Jamal," he warned, his eyes narrowing. "You don't understand what you're doing." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Jamal shot back, surprising even himself with the sharpness of his reply. The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment, it felt as if the entire courtroom had stopped breathing. Jamal scanned the faces of the crowd, taking in their wide eyes and furrowed brows. He had been invisible to them for so long, just the quiet boy sitting in the back, overshadowed by his father's towering presence. But now, every single person in that room was focused on him, waiting to see what he would do next. "Jamal," the judge said again, his voice louder this time, carrying the weight of authority he had used to command respect for decades. "If you have something to say, say it. But choose your words carefully." Jamal met his father's gaze head-on, unblinking. He had always been taught to respect authority, to follow rules, to keep quiet and stay in his lane. But what do you do when the person who enforces the rules is the one breaking them? "I've chosen my words carefully," Jamal replied, his tone unwavering. "Now it's your turn to listen." The judge's expression hardened, but he didn't interrupt again. For the first time in his life, Jamal felt like he had the upper hand, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The courtroom grew so quiet that the faint hum of the overhead lights became audible. Everyone waited, their attention glued to the young boy who dared to challenge the most powerful man in the room, his own father. Jamal exhaled slowly, steadying himself. His voice didn't waver when he spoke again. "Everything they think they know about you," he said, gesturing to the audience, "is a lie. And I'm going to prove it." The room erupted into a flurry of whispers and gasps. Spectators leaned into one another, their voices hushed but frantic as they tried to piece together what Jamal could possibly mean. "Order!" Judge Monroe barked, slamming his gavel down with a force that echoed off the walls. The room fell silent once more, but the tension only deepened. Jamal didn't flinch at the sound. His father's outburst didn't intimidate him anymore. The truth was coming, and nothing, not even the most respected judge in the city, could stop it now. In that moment, Jamal wasn't just a 15-year-old boy. He was a storm, brewing quietly for years, finally ready to break free. And when it did, no one, not even his father, would escape unscathed. The courtroom had never seen anything like this before. It wasn't every day that the son of a respected judge stood before his father, accusing him of hiding a dark truth. People whispered among themselves, trying to guess what Jamal meant. But no one, not even Judge Monroe, knew the full extent of what was coming. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained calm. He had rehearsed this moment so many times in his head, playing it out in 1,000 different ways. But nothing could have prepared him for the weight of standing here, in front of so many watchful eyes, with the truth burning inside him. "Proceed," Judge Monroe said, his tone sharp, his jaw tight. He was trying to maintain control, but Jamal could see the flicker of unease in his father's eyes. The boy took a deep breath. "For years, you've told me that the law is about justice," Jamal began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You said it was about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it was. But what happens when the person breaking the law is you?" A collective gasp swept through the courtroom like a wave. People turned to each other, their faces filled with shock and confusion. Could Jamal really be accusing his own father, the man who had built his career on being fair and just? The judge's face hardened. "Careful, Jamal," he warned, his voice low and controlled. "This is a court of law, not a place for baseless accusations." Jamal felt a pang of fear at his father's words, but he refused to let it show. "I'm not making baseless accusations," he said firmly. "I have proof." The room erupted again, voices rising in disbelief. Someone near the back muttered, "What kind of proof could he possibly have?" Another person whispered, "Is this some kind of prank?" The judge slammed his gavel down once more. "Order in the court," he barked, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "There will be silence until this matter is addressed." The noise died down, but the tension remained. All eyes were on Jamal as he stood there, unwavering in the face of his father's authority. "Go on," the judge said, his voice colder now. "If you claim to have proof, let's hear it." Jamal swallowed hard, his throat dry. This was the moment he had been preparing for, and he couldn't afford to falter. He reached into his backpack, pulling out a stack of papers and a small USB drive. "These," he said, holding up the documents, "are records of every case you've ruled on in the past 5 years. I went through them all." The judge's eyebrows furrowed, his expression a mix of confusion and anger. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Jamal took a step closer, his voice gaining strength. "There are patterns in these cases, patterns that show favoritism, hidden deals, and decisions that don't make sense unless you're covering something up." The spectators gasped again. This time, the whispers turned into a low murmur that filled the room. People were no longer just shocked, they were starting to wonder if there was some truth to Jamal's words. "That's enough," the judge said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You're out of line, Jamal. You don't know what you're talking about." Jamal clenched his fists, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Stop pretending," he snapped, his voice rising. "I've seen the way you act when no one's watching. I've heard the phone calls late at night, the ones you think I don't notice. You're not the man people think you are, and it's time they knew the truth." The judge's face turned red, a mixture of anger and panic flashing in his eyes. "You're treading on dangerous ground," he warned. "Am I?" Jamal shot back. "Or are you just afraid that I'll expose you for who you really are?" The tension in the room was unbearable now. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Jamal continued, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "You taught me to believe in justice, Dad. You told me that the truth always matters. But you've been living a lie, and I can't stay silent anymore." Judge Monroe stared at his son, his hands gripping the edge of the bench so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For the first time, he seemed at a loss for words. "Tell me, Dad," Jamal said, his voice softer now but no less powerful. "Do you really think you can hide the truth forever?" The judge didn't answer. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, as everyone in the courtroom waited to see what would happen next. Jamal took another step forward, his eyes locked on his father's. "You always told me that justice starts at home. Well, today, it starts with you." The murmurs started again, growing louder this time. People in the gallery whispered frantically, their voices a mix of shock, disbelief, and curiosity. "Is this true?" someone asked. Could the judge really be involved in something illegal? The judge slammed his gavel down again, the sharp sound silencing the crowd. But it couldn't silence the doubt that was beginning to creep into their minds. Jamal knew he had their attention now. The courtroom was his stage, and the truth was his weapon. He just had to make sure he used it wisely. "Dad," he said, his voice firm but laced with emotion, "you told me to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it is. That's what I'm doing. And I'm not stopping until everyone knows the truth." The judge's eyes narrowed, his composure cracking ever so slightly. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it usually carried. Jamal stepped closer, holding up the papers in his hand. "I know enough," he said. "And I'm not afraid to show the world who you really are." The room was silent again, the weight of Jamal's words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. For years, Jamal had lived in his father's shadow, watching as people praised the man they thought they knew. But today, He wasn't just a boy standing up to his father. He was a voice for the truth, a beacon of justice in a world that often turned a blind eye. And as he stood there, facing the man who had always seemed invincible, Jamal realized something important: the truth was more powerful than any gavel, any title, or any reputation. The storm had begun, and there was no turning back. Jamal Monroe had always lived in the shadow of his father. From the outside, Judge Thomas Monroe was everything a man should aspire to be: respected, powerful, and untouchable. People in their city admired him, pointing to him as the very definition of integrity. In courtrooms, his word carried weight, his rulings were final, unquestionable. Neighbors spoke his name with reverence, and colleagues treated him as if he were made of something stronger than mere flesh and blood. But Jamal had a different view. From the inside, from the safety or perhaps the prison of their home, he had seen the cracks that others refused to acknowledge. He had seen the shadows his father carried, the secrets he tried to bury, and the moments of raw, unfiltered anger that slipped through his polished exterior. It had started when Jamal was young, too young to fully understand the weight of what he was seeing. He would sit at the top of the stairs late at night, his small legs tucked under him, as he listened to his father's voice rise and fall in conversations that didn't sound right. "You're asking for too much," his father had whispered harshly into the phone one night, his tone clipped and cold. Jamal couldn't see his face, but he could picture the tight set of his jaw, the way he clenched his fists when he was frustrated. This wasn't the deal. "You know what's at stake if this gets out." Even at 8 years old, Jamal had known something was wrong. But what could he do? He was just a kid, and his father was a giant, a man who commanded respect everywhere he went. Jamal had learned quickly that questioning his father led to nowhere. If anything, it made things worse. "Why don't you trust me?" Jamal had asked one day, his voice trembling as he tried to understand why his father always seemed so distant. "Because you don't know how the world works yet," his father had replied, his tone sharp and dismissive. "When you grow up, you'll understand that some things are better left unsaid." That answer had stuck with Jamal, haunting him as the years went by. The older he got, the more he saw, and the harder it became to ignore the truth. His father wasn't just hiding things, he was living a lie. At school, teachers would gush about how lucky Jamal was to have such a remarkable father. "You must be so proud," they'd say, smiling warmly. "Your dad is a real hero in this community." Jamal would nod and force a polite smile, but inside, he felt like screaming. How could he explain that the man everyone admired wasn't the man he knew at home? How could he tell them about the anger, the coldness, the way his father seemed to care more about his image than his family? The weight of it all became heavier with each passing year. Jamal started to notice things that didn't add up. There were nights when his father would come home later than usual, his face drawn and his tie askew. There were whispered phone calls and shredded papers in the trash. There were arguments with Jamal's mother, low, heated exchanges that always ended with her retreating to their bedroom, her face pale and her eyes filled with tears she never explained. "Your father is under a lot of pressure," she would say whenever Jamal asked what was wrong. "It's not your place to question him." But Jamal couldn't stop questioning. He couldn't stop noticing the way his father's words and actions didn't align. Judge Monroe preached about justice, fairness, and accountability, yet at home, he ruled with an iron fist. One night, when Jamal was 13, he overheard a conversation that changed everything. His father was in his study, the door slightly ajar, his voice low and urgent. "I told you, this can't come back to me," he said. "If anyone finds out, it'll ruin everything." Jamal's stomach twisted as he pressed his ear closer to the door, trying to make sense of the words. What couldn't come back to him? What was so important that it could ruin everything? That was the night Jamal started digging. He didn't know what he was looking for at first, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his chest. His father's study became a maze of secrets, each drawer and file a potential clue. Jamal would wait until the house was quiet, until his parents were asleep, before sneaking in to search for answers. The first time he found something, his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. It was a letter, typed neatly and marked with a seal he didn't recognize. The words were formal but carried an undertone of menace, hinting at deals and arrangements that didn't sound legal. Jamal didn't understand everything he read, but he understood enough. His father wasn't just hiding something, he was hiding something big. When he tried to confront his father, the response was swift and brutal. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Judge Monroe had said, his voice icy as he towered over Jamal. "And you'd better stop snooping around if you know what's good for you." Jamal had tried to stand his ground. "I just want to know the truth," he said, his voice trembling. "The truth," his father sneered. "The truth is complicated, Jamal. You wouldn't understand it even if I explained it to you." That conversation marked a turning point. Jamal realized that his father would never admit to his wrongdoings, no matter how obvious they were. If Jamal wanted the truth to come out, he would have to find it himself. But it wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like walking through quicksand. The more Jamal uncovered, the more questions he had. Who were the people his father was meeting with in secret? What were the deals he was making, and why was he so desperate to keep them hidden? Jamal tried to talk to his mother, hoping she could help him make sense of it all. But she just shook her head, her expression weary. "Your father does what he has to do," she said softly. "It's not our place to interfere." "Not our place," Jamal repeated, his voice rising. "Mom, he's supposed to be a judge. He's supposed to stand for justice. How can you just look the other way?" "Because sometimes, Jamal," she replied, her voice breaking, "looking the other way is the only way to survive." Her words felt like a slap in the face. Jamal didn't want to survive, he wanted the truth. But it became clear that he was alone in his fight. At school, things weren't much better. The other kids either idolized Judge Monroe or resented him, and both groups took it out on Jamal. "Hey, your dad locked up my uncle," one boy sneered one day, shoving Jamal against a locker. "You must be real proud of him, huh?" Another time, a girl in his class leaned over and whispered, "What's it like being the son of a celebrity? Do you get special treatment, or does he just ignore you like everyone else?" Jamal didn't respond. He had learned to keep his head down, to stay quiet and endure the taunts. But inside, he was boiling. None of them knew the truth. None of them understood what it was like to live in his world. The weight of it all, the secrets, the lies, the isolation, was almost too much to bear. But Jamal refused to give up. "I'm going to prove it," he whispered to himself late one night, staring at the stack of documents he had hidden under his bed. "I'm going to show everyone who he really is." And that's when the plan began to take shape. Jamal didn't know how long it would take or how much it would cost him, but he was determined. His father might be a giant, but even giants could fall. For years, Jamal had been silenced, ignored, and underestimated. But he wasn't a little boy anymore. He was ready to fight, no matter what it took. And he was starting to realize something important: the truth had a power of its own. Once it started to surface, there was no stopping it. Jamal's world felt like a maze. Every turn led to another dead end, and every question only created more. The weight of what he knew and what he suspected pressed on him like a boulder. It wasn't just the lies or the secrets. It was the loneliness of carrying them, the silence that wrapped around him at school, at home, everywhere. For most of his life, Jamal had been invisible, even in his own family. His father was always busy, his mother was always tired, and both seemed to move through the house like actors performing in a play. They smiled when they had to, spoke when it was expected, and avoided anything that resembled real connection. There were no family dinners where they laughed and shared stories. There were no bedtime talks where his parents asked about his dreams or fears. Instead, there were hushed conversations behind closed doors, terse replies when he asked too many questions, and an unspoken rule that some things simply weren't meant to be discussed. But Jamal couldn't stop thinking about them. He couldn't stop replaying the phone calls he'd overheard, the shredded papers he'd pieced back together late at night, the look on his mother's face when she thought no one was watching. She looked broken. And maybe that was what hurt the most. Jamal loved his mother fiercely, even if she never seemed to have the strength to fight back. He could see the way she avoided eye contact when his father raised his voice. He noticed how her hands trembled when she poured her coffee in the mornings, her eyes red from another sleepless night. "Mom, why don't you leave?" he asked one day, his voice barely more than a whisper. She looked at him like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. "Leave," she repeated, her voice hollow. "And go where, Jamal? What would we do? How would we survive?" Her words stung, but Jamal understood what she meant. Judge Monroe wasn't just a man, he was a force. He controlled everything, from the way their household ran to the way people treated them in public. Even if his mother wanted to leave, where could she go that his father's shadow wouldn't follow? Still, it didn't stop Jamal from hoping. Hoping that maybe, somehow, he could be the one to change things. His search for answers consumed him. At first, it was small things: staying up late to listen for those whispered phone calls, flipping through the papers his father left on the dining room table. But as the weeks turned into months, his determination grew. He started sneaking into his father's study more often, using every quiet moment to dig through the files and folders that seemed out of place. He learned how to pick the lock on the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, where his father kept the documents he clearly didn't want anyone to see. Some nights, Jamal felt like a detective in one of the crime novels he loved to read. He would sit cross-legged on the floor of his room, spreading the papers out in front of him, trying to connect the dots. He didn't always understand what he was looking at. There were legal terms and financial jargon that went over his head, but he understood enough to know that something was wrong. One document stood out more than the others. It was a list of names, handwritten in neat, precise letters. Some of the names had check marks next to them, while others had XS. Jamal didn't recognize most of the names, but a few of them sounded familiar. He spent hours searching online, trying to piece together who these people were and why they mattered. It didn't take long for him to notice a pattern. The names with checkmarks belonged to people who had benefited from his father's rulings: business owners, politicians, even a few high-ranking officials. The names with XS? They were the ones who had lost everything. Jamal's stomach churned as he realized what it meant. His father wasn't just bending the law, he was deciding who won and who lost, based on deals no one else knew about. For days, Jamal couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the people his father had betrayed. He thought about the families who had lost their homes, the workers who had lost their jobs, all because his father had chosen profit over justice. He thought about the words his father had said so many times: "The law is the backbone of society. Without it, we have chaos." But what was the law, really, if the people in charge of it were corrupt? Jamal wanted to confront his father right then and there. He wanted to march into the study, slam the papers on the desk, and demand answers. But he knew better. His father wouldn't admit to anything, and Jamal would only end up punished or worse. So he waited. And while he waited, he gathered more evidence. The USB drive became his lifeline. It was where he stored everything he found: emails, scanned documents, even recordings of the phone calls he managed to capture using an old voice recorder he'd found in the attic. Each new piece of evidence felt like a victory, but it also felt like a burden. Jamal wasn't just collecting facts, he was collecting proof that his father, the man everyone trusted, was a liar. Some days, the weight of it all made him want to give up. He would sit on the edge of his bed, staring at the USB drive in his hand, wondering if it was worth it. What if no one believes me, he whispered to himself one night. What if they all take his side? The thought terrified him. His father's reputation was ironclad, and Jamal was just a kid. Who would believe his word over the word of a man who had spent decades building a flawless image? But then he thought about his mother. He thought about the way she flinched every time the phone rang, the way she avoided answering questions about his father's late nights. He thought about the people on the list, the ones with XS next to their names, and the lives that had been ruined. And he knew he couldn't stay silent. It wasn't just about proving his father wrong anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, even if it meant standing alone. The day he decided to take action, Jamal felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear because he knew the risks, and relief because he was finally doing something. He started small, testing the waters to see how far he could go without getting caught. He reached out to a few trusted people: his history teacher, who always encouraged him to ask questions, and an old family friend who had left town years ago under mysterious circumstances. They didn't have all the answers, but they gave him something just as valuable: encouragement. Trust your instincts, his teacher had said, her voice quiet but firm. If you believe in what you're doing, don't let anyone stop you. Those words stayed with Jamal, echoing in his mind as he worked late into the night, piecing together the puzzle that was his father's life. The tension in the house grew thicker with each passing day. His father seemed to sense that something was off, though he couldn't pinpoint what it was. He started watching Jamal more closely, asking questions he never used to ask. "What are you working on?" he asked one evening, glancing at the stack of notebooks on Jamal's desk. "Just homework," Jamal replied quickly, shoving the notebooks into his backpack. His father narrowed his eyes but didn't press further. Jamal knew it was only a matter of time before his father figured out what he was up to. But by then, it would be too late. The truth was coming, whether his father was ready for it or not. And Jamal was ready to fight for it, no matter the cost. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the kind that made even the air feel thick and heavy. All eyes were fixed on Jamal, the teenager who had walked into the lion's den with nothing but his words and the truth he had carefully gathered. His father sat on the bench, towering in his black robe, but something about his expression had shifted. He wasn't the unshakable Judge Monroe now. He looked like a man trying desperately to keep a secret from spilling into the light. Jamal's hands shook as he clutched the edge of the witness stand, but his voice was steady. He didn't flinch when his father's gaze bore into him like a storm. Instead, he took a deep breath and began. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "It's about the people who've been hurt. The people no one talks about." The gallery erupted in murmurs, and the bailiff had to call for order. Jamal waited, his heart hammering in his chest. He hadn't come this far to back down now. Jamal's investigation wasn't just a game anymore, it was a mission. Every piece of evidence he found added a new layer to the picture he was painting, one that revealed just how far his father had fallen from the ideals he claimed to uphold. It started small, with whispers and rumors. People in town talked about how Judge Monroe always seemed to favor certain lawyers or rule in favor of particular companies. But those were just words, nothing Jamal could use. He needed proof. One night, as Jamal scrolled through the recordings on his voice recorder, he stumbled upon something chilling. It was a phone call his father had taken late at night, the kind he always thought no one else could hear. "I don't care what it costs," his father's voice said, low and sharp. "Make it disappear." Jamal played the recording over and over, trying to piece together the context. What was his father trying to hide? And who was he talking to? The court cases his father handled weren't random. The ones that landed on his desk often had connections to wealthy business owners or political figures. Jamal spent hours online, looking up case files, reading articles, and tracking down every lead he could find. One case stood out more than the others, a local man named Hector Ruiz who had been evicted from his home after a foreclosure ruling. Jamal remembered seeing Hector at the grocery store once, his shoulders hunched and his face lined with worry. Back then, Jamal hadn't thought much of it. But now, he couldn't stop thinking about how Hector's name was on that list, the one with XS next to it. Jamal found Hector working at a car repair shop on the edge of town. The man looked surprised to see him, but when Jamal explained why he was there, Hector's expression shifted from confusion to anger. "Your father ruined me," Hector said, wiping his hands on a rag. "He sided with the bank even though they lied about the paperwork. I lost everything, my house, my savings, my kids' college fund. And for what? So some bigwig could line their pockets." Jamal's stomach twisted. He didn't want to believe it, but Hector's story matched the other pieces of evidence he had found. His father's rulings weren't just biased, they were orchestrated. One night, as he sat in his room piecing together his findings, he noticed headlights pulling into the driveway. His father was home earlier than usual, and he wasn't alone. Jamal peeked through the curtains and saw a man in a dark suit step out of the car. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces tense. Jamal couldn't make out the words, but the body language was enough to tell him that whatever they were discussing wasn't good. His father stormed into the house, his face a mask of anger. Jamal ducked back into his room, his heart racing. He had never seen his father like this before, agitated, almost panicked. "Don't worry," his father said into his phone later that night. "The boy doesn't know anything." Jamal froze. The boy. His father was talking about him. He had been there plenty of times before, tagging along with his mother to watch his father work. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't just a curious kid, he was looking for answers. The clerk at the front desk barely glanced at him as he walked past, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Jamal made his way to the archives, a quiet room filled with rows of filing cabinets and stacks of old case files. He spent hours combing through the files, looking for anything that could connect the dots. And then he found it, a stack of papers marked with his father's initials. The documents detailed a series of financial transactions, all linked to a shadowy company Jamal had never heard of. The amounts were staggering, and the dates lined up with some of the most controversial cases his father had ruled on. Jamal's hands shook as he stuffed the papers into his backpack. He didn't know what he was going to do with them yet, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about bad decisions or moral failings. This was corruption, plain and simple. Jamal couldn't look at his father the same way anymore. Every smile, every kind word, felt like a lie. His mother seemed to notice the change in him, but she didn't ask questions. "You've been quiet lately," she said one morning over breakfast. "I've got a lot on my mind," Jamal replied, staring into his cereal. His father barely glanced up from his newspaper. "Stay focused on school," he said. "That's all you need to worry about." Jamal bit back the urge to respond. If only his father knew just how much he was worrying about. Jamal couldn't hold it in any longer. As his father went on about his latest case, Jamal slammed his fork down on the table. "How do you sleep at night?" he asked, his voice trembling. The room went silent. His mother's eyes widened, and his father's face darkened. "What did you just say?" his father demanded. "You heard me," Jamal shot back. "How do you sleep at night, knowing what you've done to people like Hector Ruiz?" His father's expression flickered, just for a moment. But then he straightened, his voice cold and sharp. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Don't I?" Jamal stood, his hands balled into fists. "I've seen the papers. I've heard the phone calls. I know about the bribes, the backroom deals, all of it." His mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. His father rose slowly from his seat, his eyes burning with anger. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Jamal met his gaze, his fear giving way to determination. "Maybe not," he said. "But I'm not going to let you get away with this." Piece by piece, Jamal presented the evidence he had gathered. The documents, the recordings, the testimony from people like Hector Ruiz, it all painted a picture of a man who had built his career on lies and betrayal. The gallery was silent, the air heavy with tension. Jamal's voice was steady as he spoke, but inside, his heart was pounding. When he finally finished, he looked up at his father. The man who had always seemed so invincible now looked small and defeated. And for the first time, Jamal felt like he wasn't just a shadow in his father's world. He was the light that was finally breaking through the darkness. In the weeks leading up to this moment, Jamal had pushed himself beyond what any 15-year-old should have to endure. His nights were filled with whispers of doubt, fear that his father's power might crush him before he even had a chance to speak. But each time those doubts crept in, he reminded himself of the faces he'd seen, the people his father's rulings had left broken and destitute. One evening, while poring over the documents he had taken from the courthouse, Jamal stumbled across something unexpected, a signature he recognized. It wasn't his father's. It belonged to a family friend, Mr. Gerald Baxter. Gerald was a well-known attorney, someone who had dined at their table and shared stories of justice and righteousness. But here he was, implicated in transactions that pointed to bribery and fraud. Jamal felt a pang of betrayal sharper than any he had felt before. Gerald had been like an uncle to him, someone he had trusted. How deep did this corruption run? And how many people were complicit in keeping it hidden? Fueled by a mixture of anger and determination, Jamal decided to confront Gerald directly. He biked across town, his backpack filled with the damning papers. When he arrived at Gerald's sprawling home, the lawyer greeted him with a warm smile, as though nothing were amiss. "Jamal. What a surprise. Come in, Gerald said, ushering him inside. Jamal stepped into the grand living room, his gaze wandering over the expensive furniture and framed certificates on the walls. Everything about this place screamed success, but now it felt tainted. "I need to talk to you," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. He pulled out the papers and placed them on the coffee table. "About this?" Gerald's smile froze. His eyes darted to the documents, and for a moment, his composure cracked. He quickly recovered, laughing nervously. "Where did you get these, Jamal? This is grown-up stuff, nothing for you to worry about." Jamal didn't flinch. "It's everything to worry about. These papers show you were part of the deals that ruined people's lives. And you worked with my father to make it happen." Gerald's face darkened, the friendly facade slipping away. "Listen, kid," he said, his tone low and threatening. "You don't know what you're talking about. This world isn't as black and white as you think. Your father did what he had to do. We all did. Ruining lives is something you had to do." Jamal shot back, his voice rising. "Hector Ruiz lost everything because of you. How many more are there?" Gerald's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Jamal thought he might lash out. But instead, the lawyer sighed and slumped into a chair, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand," Gerald muttered. "This isn't just about your father or me. There are bigger forces at play. If you keep digging, you're going to get yourself hurt." Jamal left Gerald's house with a mix of fear and resolve. He had expected denial, maybe even excuses, but the subtle warning in Gerald's words was something he hadn't anticipated. What did he mean by bigger forces? Was his father just a pawn in a much larger game? That night, as Jamal sat in his room going over his findings, his phone buzzed. The message was from an unknown number: "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." His hands trembled as he read the words. Who had sent this? Gerald. Someone else tied to the corruption? For the first time, Jamal realized just how dangerous his mission had become. But fear wasn't enough to stop him. If anything, it strengthened his resolve. Whoever was trying to silence him clearly had something to hide, and Jamal was determined to bring it to light. Jamal returned to the courthouse, this time more cautious than before. He moved through the shadows, avoiding the security cameras as best he could. In the archives, he discovered a series of documents that connected his father to a powerful corporation, Draxon Industries. The company had been involved in multiple lawsuits over unsafe working conditions, but Judge Monroe had ruled in their favor every time. Digging deeper, Jamal found financial records that showed large sums of money being funneled into offshore accounts linked to his father. The weight of the discovery pressed down on him. This wasn't just corruption, it was a betrayal of everything his father had claimed to stand for. Determined to gather more evidence, Jamal sought out Hector Ruiz again. This time, he brought the files with him, hoping to find something that could tie Hector's case to the larger web of corruption. When Jamal showed Hector the documents, the man's eyes widened. I knew it, Hector said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and vindication. I knew they were working together to cover this up. Hector went on to explain how his case had been handled. He had presented evidence that the bank had falsified documents, but the court had ignored it. Your father didn't even look at my evidence, Hector said bitterly. He ruled in favor of the bank without a second thought. Jamal recorded Hector's story, knowing it would be a powerful piece of the puzzle. But as he listened to the man's pain, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame. His father had been the cause of so much suffering. The more Jamal uncovered, the more isolated he felt. He couldn't share any of this with his mother. She wouldn't believe him, or worse, she'd try to protect his father. He had no allies, no one to turn to for guidance. But he wasn't completely alone. One evening, as he walked home from school, a woman approached him. She introduced herself as Linda Thompson, a journalist who had been investigating corruption in the local court system for years. I've been following your father's career, Linda said, her voice measured. And I've heard whispers about what you've been doing. If you're willing to share what you've found, I can help you. Jamal hesitated. Could he trust her? He had worked so hard to keep this secret, but Linda's presence felt like a lifeline. After a long pause, he handed her a copy of the files. I just want the truth to come out, he said. With Linda's help, Jamal prepared for the biggest challenge of his life. They worked late into the night, organizing the evidence into a clear, undeniable case. Linda warned him that going public would come with risks, but Jamal was ready. This isn't just about me, he said. It's about everyone my father hurt. They deserve justice. As the trial date approached, the tension in Jamal's home grew unbearable. His father seemed distracted, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet unease. Jamal wondered if he suspected what was coming. The night before the trial, Jamal sat in his room, staring at the papers spread out before him. He knew that once he stepped into that courtroom, there would be no turning back. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. He had done everything he could. Now, it was time to face the truth. Jamal's voice shook the courtroom as he laid out his findings, his words growing stronger with each revelation. The audience leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the young man's courage. And as Judge Monroe's carefully constructed facade began to crumble, Jamal knew he was no longer a shadow in his father's world. He was a force to be reckoned with, a beacon of truth in a sea of lies. But the full story was far from over. The most damning evidence was yet to come. And when it did, it would shake the courtroom to its very core. The courtroom was silent, except for the rhythmic tapping of a pen against the polished wood. Every eye was on Jamal as he stood, gripping the folder that contained the truth he had fought so hard to uncover. His heart raced, but his resolve was unshaken. This was the moment he had prepared for, the moment he would finally expose everything. Judge Monroe sat on the bench, his face a mask of calm authority, but there was a slight tension in his jaw. He had noticed the shift in his son's demeanor over the past weeks. Jamal had always been a quiet boy, reluctant to challenge his father's authority. But now, the young man standing in the courtroom looked different, determined, unafraid. "Proceed," Judge Monroe said, his voice steady. But Jamal caught the flicker of uncertainty in his father's eyes. Jamal glanced at the audience. Journalists, lawyers, and members of the public leaned forward, eager to see what this 15-year-old boy could possibly have to say. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the center of the room. "Your Honor," Jamal began, his voice firm despite the weight of the moment. "I stand here today not as your son, but as someone seeking the truth. The truth about what you've done." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Judge Monroe's expression hardened. "Careful, Jamal," he said, his tone laced with warning. "This is a courtroom, not a place for personal grievances." Jamal didn't falter. "This isn't personal, Dad. This is about justice, the justice you've claimed to represent." Jamal opened the folder, pulling out a stack of documents. He held up the first page for the courtroom to see. "This is a financial record showing large deposits made to an offshore account under the name R. Monroe. These deposits coincide with rulings you made in favor of Draxon Industries, a company notorious for exploiting its workers and violating safety regulations." Gasps erupted from the gallery. Judge Monroe's lips tightened, but he said nothing. Jamal continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've spoken to the families affected by these rulings. People like Hector Ruiz, who lost everything when you sided with the bank that foreclosed on his home. They presented evidence in court, proof that the bank was acting illegally, but you ignored it. Why? Because you were being paid to." Objection. A lawyer from the defense team stood, his voice sharp. "These are unsubstantiated claims made by a child." Jamal turned to the lawyer, unflinching. "The evidence is in the documents I've submitted to the court. If you doubt me, feel free to verify them." The judge presiding over the case, a stern woman with sharp eyes, nodded. "The documents will be reviewed. Continue, Jamal." Jamal pulled out another set of papers, his hands trembling slightly. "This is a transcript of a conversation between my father and Gerald Baxter, a lawyer who has worked with him for years. In this conversation, they discuss how to manipulate a case to favor Draxon Industries in exchange for a 7-figure payout." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and the sound of camera shutters filled the air. Judge Monroe's composure was beginning to crack. His hands gripped the edge of his desk, and a vein pulsed in his temple. "Enough," Judge Monroe said, his voice cold. "This has gone far enough, Jamal." Jamal's eyes met his father's, and for a moment, the courtroom seemed to fade away. "No, Dad. It hasn't. People trusted you. I trusted you. And you betrayed all of us." The presiding judge called for order, her gavel striking the wood. "Judge Monroe, you are not permitted to interrupt these proceedings. Jamal, continue." Jamal reached for the final piece of evidence, a video recording stored on a small USB drive. He held it up for everyone to see. "This is a video showing my father meeting with representatives from Draxon Industries in a private setting. In this meeting, they discuss how to suppress evidence and intimidate witnesses. This recording was obtained legally, and it confirms everything I've said." The gallery was in chaos now. Some people shouted, demanding answers, while others sat in stunned silence. Judge Monroe's face was pale, his confident facade completely shattered. "You don't understand," Judge Monroe said, his voice barely audible. It's not as simple as it seems. Jamal shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. It's exactly as simple as it seems. You chose power and money over the people you were supposed to protect. Over me. Over Mom. Over everything we stood for. The presiding judge signaled for the video to be played. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. The recording was clear and undeniable. Judge Monroe's voice filled the room, discussing payouts, evidence tampering, and backroom deals with an ease that was chilling. When the video ended, the room was silent. All eyes turned to Judge Monroe, whose head was bowed. He looked older, smaller, as though the weight of his actions had finally caught up to him. "Do you deny this evidence?" the presiding judge asked. Judge Monroe raised his head, his face lined with defeat. "No," he said quietly. "I don't." The courtroom erupted once more. Reporters rushed to file their stories, while lawyers debated the legal implications of the revelations. Security escorted Judge Monroe from the bench, and for the first time in his career, he looked like a man completely lost. Jamal stood in the center of the chaos, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He had done what he set out to do, expose the truth. But it had come at a cost. The man he had once admired, the man he had called his father, was now a disgraced figure. As he left the courtroom, Jamal was surrounded by reporters shouting questions, but he ignored them. He wasn't doing this for fame or recognition. He was doing it for justice and for the people his father had wronged. Outside the courthouse, Jamal stood on the steps, breathing in the crisp air. Linda Thompson, the journalist who had helped him prepare, approached with a proud smile. "You were incredible in there," she said. Jamal nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It wasn't easy. But it was the right thing to do." Linda placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've started something bigger than you realize. This isn't just about your father, it's about holding people in power accountable." Jamal looked back at the courthouse, where the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. "Maybe," he said, "this is the beginning of something better." And with that, he walked away, leaving the echoes of the courtroom behind. The courtroom buzzed with uncontainable energy as the weight of Jamal's revelation settled on everyone present. Reporters whispered into their microphones, already transmitting the shocking story to a captivated public. Meanwhile, the once unshakable Judge Monroe sat slumped, his head lowered as if the enormity of his exposure had physically weighed him down. Jamal, standing tall despite the emotional whirlwind inside him, knew he wasn't done. The truth had to come out completely, no matter how deep it cut. Jamal took a step closer to the bench, his eyes fixed on his father's trembling hands. He raised his voice, not out of anger, but out of sheer determination to be heard. "Dad," Jamal said, the word heavy with emotion, "I begged you for years to listen. I told you something wasn't right, that your choices were hurting people. But you wouldn't hear me. You were too wrapped up in the image you created, Judge Monroe, the symbol of law and order." The courtroom was silent, every ear straining to catch his words. "But justice isn't about looking good in a robe," Jamal continued, his voice breaking slightly. "It's about doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything. And you failed. You failed the people who trusted you. You failed me." Judge Monroe flinched as though struck. He finally looked up at his son, his eyes hollow. For a moment, it seemed he might speak, but no words came. Instead, he sank back into his chair, his silence deafening. Jamal turned to the gallery, addressing the audience as though he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. "This isn't just about my father," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "It's about a system that lets powerful people think they're untouchable. My dad isn't the only one who's taken bribes or twisted the law for personal gain. How many others have gotten away with it because no one dared to speak up? How many lives have been destroyed while we looked the other way? The presiding judge leaned forward, her expression sharp and thoughtful. Mr. Monroe, she said, addressing Jamal formally, are you implying that there is more corruption within the judicial system tied to your father? Jamal nodded, holding up yet another set of documents. Yes, Your Honor. These emails show communications between my father and several other judges in this district. They coordinated rulings to benefit major corporations in exchange for money, gifts, and political favors. The room erupted again, this time with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Jamal waited for the noise to subside before continuing. This isn't just about my dad, he repeated, his voice quieter but no less powerful. It's about all the people who think they can manipulate justice for their own gain. And it's about the people who've been hurt because of it. Judge Monroe finally spoke, his voice weak but edged with desperation. Jamal, you don't understand. It wasn't just greed. Sometimes, the system forces you to make choices. Compromises. I didn't want to do this. Jamal stared at his father, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. You chose this, Dad. Don't blame the system for what you did. You had the power to make a difference, and you chose to abuse it. The presiding judge intervened, her voice cutting through the tension. Judge Monroe, do you admit to the allegations brought forth by your son? There was a long pause. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for an answer. Yes, Judge Monroe said finally, his voice barely audible. I admit it. The gallery erupted into chaos. Some people cheered Jamal's courage, while others shouted angrily about the betrayal they felt from a man they had once admired. The reporters couldn't write fast enough, their pens and keyboards capturing the scandal of the decade. Cameras flashed as security moved in to escort Judge Monroe from the bench. Order, the presiding judge called, her gavel striking repeatedly. This court will come to order. When the noise subsided, she turned her attention to Jamal. Mr. Monroe, your bravery in bringing this evidence to light is commendable. You've done a service not just to this court but to the people affected by your father's actions. The court will ensure a thorough investigation into all parties involved. Jamal nodded, his chest tight with a mixture of relief and sorrow. He had won, but at what cost? His father was being led away in handcuffs, his reputation and career destroyed. Jamal felt the weight of the moment, the bittersweet taste of justice served. As the courtroom began to empty, Linda Thompson, the journalist who had been Jamal's ally throughout the ordeal, approached him. You did it, she said, her voice filled with admiration. You actually did it? Jamal shook his head slowly. I didn't do this to win or prove a point. I did it because it was the right thing to do. But, it still hurts. Linda placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. That's what makes you different. You cared enough to act, even when it meant going against your own family. Not many people have that kind of courage. Jamal looked back at the emptying courtroom, his father's absence leaving a gaping hole in the space. I just hope it was worth it. I hope this changes something. It already has, Linda said. You've shown people that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. And that's a powerful message. In the days that followed, Jamal's story became a national sensation. News outlets ran headlines about the scandal, while activists and legal experts called for widespread reform in the judicial system. Jamal found himself thrust into the spotlight, his name becoming synonymous with bravery and justice. But for Jamal, the fight wasn't over. He began working with advocacy groups to push for greater transparency in the courts, using his story as a catalyst for change. Though the road was long and filled with challenges, Jamal remained steadfast. He had already faced the hardest battle of his life, and he wasn't about to stop now. One evening, weeks after the trial, Jamal sat on the steps of the courthouse, the city lights twinkling around him. He thought about his father, about the man he had admired as a child and the man he had exposed as a teenager. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but so did the hope that his actions had made a difference. Linda joined him, sitting down beside him with a warm smile. "You've done something incredible, Jamal. Don't ever forget that." Jamal nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I won't. But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who deserves justice. And I'm going to keep fighting for them." As the night stretched on, Jamal felt a quiet sense of peace. The journey had been painful, but it had also been necessary. And as he looked out at the city, he knew he had found his purpose, not just as a son seeking the truth, but as a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the security officers let Judge Monroe out in handcuffs. There was a finality in the air, a sense that something monumental had just happened, and the echoes of the day would resonate for years to come. Jamal stood at the center of it all, his eyes focused on his father's retreating back, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. He was no longer the same boy who had entered that room months ago, and he knew the people who had once doubted him were now looking at him with a newfound respect. As the doors closed behind Judge Monroe, the presiding judge stood up, her expression somber but resolute. "This court is adjourned," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "We will conduct a full investigation into the allegations presented here today, and those found guilty of corruption will face the consequences of their actions." Jamal didn't look away. He had spent years watching his father's influence, his power, his seemingly unbreakable reputation. But today, he had shattered that illusion. Today, he had shown the world that even the most powerful could be held accountable, that no one was above the law. His father had once been the very embodiment of justice, but now, through his actions, Jamal had forced a reckoning, not just for his father, but for the entire system that allowed corruption to fester. "Jamal Monroe," the presiding judge said, her tone turning softer, "what you've done here today is nothing short of heroic. You didn't have to stand up and expose the truth, but you did. You chose to fight for those who couldn't. You chose to challenge your own father because you knew it was the right thing to do." Jamal nodded, his throat tight as he tried to find his voice. "It wasn't about heroics," he said, his words steady. "It was about justice. About making sure the people who trusted the law weren't being betrayed behind closed doors." The judge's eyes softened further as she looked at him. "That's exactly what it was about, Jamal. And because of your courage, you've started a conversation, a necessary conversation about accountability and integrity in our judicial system." Jamal's heart swelled with emotion. It wasn't just his story anymore, it was everyone's. The people who had been affected by his father's rulings, those who had suffered because of his abuses of power, this moment was for them too. They weren't just bystanders to the proceedings, they were the reason he had fought so hard. As Jamal walked out of the courthouse, he was met with a wall of reporters, their cameras flashing and voices calling his name. His name was already on everyone's lips, a young man who had taken on the most powerful figure in his life, only to find out that the real power was in the truth. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, before turning to face the crowd. "Jamal," shouted a reporter from the front. "How does it feel to take down your own father?" Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly. "I didn't take him down," he said firmly. "I held him accountable. And I did it because I had to. Because this isn't about family, this is about right and wrong." The reporter pressed, "But how do you feel knowing the man you called Dad will never be the same again?" Jamal looked away, his gaze fixed on the sky above, as though searching for the words to express what he felt. "It hurts," he admitted quietly. "But it was necessary. I loved my father, and it's hard to see him go down this path. But he made choices that hurt people, and today, he's facing the consequences of those choices." As he turned to leave, Jamal was met with a mix of cheers and jeers from the crowd. People had varying reactions to his actions. Some supported him completely, others were angry at what he had revealed. But Jamal knew that this was just the beginning. His journey was far from over. The day after the trial, Jamal received a call from an old friend, Daryl. "Hey, man," Daryl said, his voice tentative. "I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you." "We all are." Jamal took a moment before replying. "Thanks, Daryl. It's still a lot to process." Daryl's tone turned serious. "You changed everything, Jamal. You gave people hope. Now, maybe they'll start believing they can make a difference too." Jamal smiled slightly. "I hope so. But this isn't just about me. It's about all the people who've been ignored, pushed aside, or mistreated by the system. I want to keep fighting for them." Daryl's voice was filled with admiration. "You're going to do more than fight, man. You're going to change the world. Starting with the way people think about justice." Jamal let out a long breath, feeling a weight he hadn't noticed until now. "I don't know if I can change the world, Daryl. But I know I can keep pushing for change one step at a time." And that's what Jamal set out to do. He joined local advocacy groups, using his story to inspire others to stand up and demand accountability. He became a voice for those who felt powerless, using the lessons he had learned from his father's betrayal as a guide. Judge Monroe's trial was only the beginning. As more details came to light, it became clear that his corruption was part of a larger network, one that reached into the highest levels of the judicial system. Jamal's revelations sparked an investigation that uncovered evidence of widespread abuse of power, from falsified documents to secret payouts. The ripple effect of his bravery was felt across the country as other victims of judicial corruption began to come forward, sharing their stories. But for every new revelation, there was another layer of pain for Jamal to sift through. The people whose lives had been upended by his father's rulings, families who had lost homes, jobs, loved ones, these were the faces he kept seeing in his mind. Justice wasn't just about making his father pay, it was about making sure others weren't hurt the same way again. Months passed, and Jamal's role as a whistleblower brought with it its own set of challenges. The media scrutiny was intense, with every aspect of his life under a microscope. But Jamal was determined to stay focused on the mission, pushing for real change, not just a temporary fix. He worked with lawyers, investigators, and community leaders to craft policies aimed at increasing transparency in the judicial system, to prevent future abuses of power. The backlash was harsh. There were threats, both to Jamal and his family. People who had once been friends now turned away from him, unable to reconcile their image of his father with the man he had revealed. But Jamal never wavered. He knew that this wasn't just about exposing a few bad apples, it was about creating a system where justice wasn't just a word on paper but a reality for every person who entered a courtroom. Jamal found solace in the support of those who understood the importance of what he was doing. His mother was his biggest ally, a constant source of encouragement even when the world seemed against them. She had always believed in his ability to make a difference, and watching her son take on such an enormous task only strengthened her faith in him. "You're doing something incredible, Jamal," she would often say, squeezing his hand when the weight of it all felt too much. "You've already changed so many lives. Don't ever forget that." And as the investigations continued, as new cases were brought to light and new reforms were implemented, Jamal knew he couldn't afford to forget, not for a second. The fight was long, but it was also necessary. The final report on the investigation was published a year after Jamal's revelations, detailing the full extent of Judge Monroe's misconduct and the impact it had on countless lives. It called for sweeping reforms in the judicial system, changes that would make it harder for individuals to abuse their power for personal gain. Jamal's story had become a catalyst for action, a symbol of what could happen when one person dared to challenge the status quo. As he watched the news reports about the reforms, Jamal felt a sense of pride and relief. The journey had been arduous, filled with obstacles, but it had been worth it. People were beginning to trust the system again, believing that justice could be blind to power and wealth. "Look at what you've done," Linda said, joining Jamal on his porch one evening. "This isn't just a story, it's a movement." Jamal leaned back in his chair, looking out at the quiet street. "I never thought it would go this far," he admitted. "I just wanted to make sure no one else had to go through what I went through." Linda smiled. "And you did that. You made a difference, Jamal. You changed the world, one piece at a time." For Jamal, the fight wasn't over. There would always be more to do, more battles to fight. But in that moment, sitting on his porch with his friend, he felt a sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had faced his father, held him accountable, and in doing so, had sparked a conversation about justice that would continue for generations. Jamal stood there, looking at the empty courtroom around him, and felt a weight settle in his chest. The echoes of his father's footsteps had faded into silence, but the impact of that day was still very much alive. As he turned to leave, he knew his journey was just beginning. This wasn't the end, but rather a new chapter in his life. The story he had started wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about inspiring others to find the courage to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The room was empty now, but it had once been filled with people who had watched in horror as the truth was laid bare. Jamal had put himself on the line, not just to bring his father to justice, but to show everyone who doubted him, who saw him as just another boy struggling to make his way in the world, that he was more than that. He was a young man with a voice, a message, and the courage to use them. He thought about the conversation he had with his mother after the trial, how she had looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Jamal." For so long, he had doubted himself, questioned his ability to make a difference. But that day, as he stood before his father and the world, he had found the strength to finally believe that he could do more than just survive, he could make a change. Jamal's story wasn't just about the betrayal of a father, it was about the power of truth. It was about understanding that sometimes, to bring about real change, you had to confront those you loved most, those who had the most to lose from the revelations you carried. Jamal had learned that courage wasn't about fighting the easiest battles, it was about standing up to the people you love to defend what's right, even when it seemed impossible. Justice doesn't wear a robe, he had told the courtroom that day. It lives in those who dare to speak the truth. It wasn't just a soundbite, it was his truth. Jamal had seen his father as a symbol of what justice should be: honest, fair, above reproach. But he had also seen the reality, how power could be used to manipulate, to control, to escape consequences. In the end, it was his decision to challenge that reality that had set him apart. The story of Jamal was a story of resilience and determination. It was about a young man who, when faced with the darkest parts of his family and his community, chose to fight for the light. He chose to be the voice for those who couldn't speak, those who had been silenced by fear, by silence, by the system itself. It was about understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to stand alone, to be the one who speaks the truth even when no one else is willing to listen. Jamal's journey was a reminder that every person had a choice whether to accept the world as it was or to work to change it. He had chosen the latter, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. He had realized that the fight for justice was never just about a courtroom, it was about the everyday battles, the small acts of courage that made a difference. It was about refusing to be silenced, about refusing to accept the status quo, no matter how many people told him it was impossible. As he looked back on that day, Jamal knew he had done what he had set out to do. He had exposed the truth, no matter how painful it was. And in doing so, he had given others permission to do the same. His story wasn't just his, it was a call to action, a reminder that everyone had a role to play in creating a just society. It was a message that courage wasn't just a matter of fighting against the odds, it was about believing in the power of one person to make a difference. Sometimes, Jamal had once told his father, the people who judge by appearances are the ones who never see it coming. His father had scoffed at the time, dismissing his words as naive. But Jamal knew better now. He had learned that the people who changed the world weren't necessarily the loudest, the most powerful, or the ones with the most resources. They were the ones who dared to speak up, who dared to stand out, who dared to challenge the systems that were supposed to protect them. As Jamal walked out of the courthouse that day, he carried with him not just his father's betrayal but also the hope of a new beginning. He had shown that even the most broken families could find healing, that even the most powerful could be brought to justice. And as he made his way into the future, Jamal knew his story was far from over, it was just beginning. Because now, he had a new mission, to continue the fight for truth, to continue speaking out against injustice, no matter where it might hide. Justice isn't just a concept, he thought as he stepped into the sunlight. It's something we all have to fight for, every day. And if I can do it, then anyone can. That was the message he wanted to leave with the world, an invitation to join him in the fight for a better tomorrow. It was a call to be brave, to be bold, to believe that one person really could change everything. And so Jamal's journey continued, not as a story of victory but as a story of progress, a reminder that the road to justice was often long and fraught with obstacles, but it was always worth traveling. Because every step forward, every revelation, every moment of truth was a step closer to a world where everyone could stand up, speak out, and make a difference. And in the end, that was the legacy he wanted to leave, the legacy of a young man who dared to speak the truth, even when it was the hardest thing to do.